You to close the doors. Waging peace, looking back to look ahead. If I could invite the panelists on stage. His Excellency Moussa Mara, the former Prime Minister of Mali and the member of the Club de Madrid. His Excellency Stephen Harper, former Prime Minister of Canada. Espen Barth Ide, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Norway. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament, Lok Sabha in India, and also the Chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Comfort Ero, President and CEO, International Crisis Group, United Kingdom. Moderator, Yalda Hakim, Lead World News Presenter, Sky News in the United Kingdom. If I could request the panelists to take their seats, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we dive into the conversation, it's my pleasure to invite Doug Nylander, Director, the Norwegian Center for Conflict Resolution, to give some scene-setting remarks ahead of the panel.
I hope we like the way you said our scene.
Thank you. Good morning. This is a crucial panel. The world is more divided and violent than it has been in a long time. And the shifts underway in the international system are likely to exacerbate this trend. The peacemaking field has already tried to alter its approach in order to adapt, successfully in some cases, but with still some way to go in many others. We need to look back and identify lessons from past successes and failures. But we need also to have a candid conversation about how to best collaborate in pursuit of what should be our shared goal. Fostering peaceful and inclusive societies at peace with one another, which respect the rights and dignity of all. To set the scene, I will share some brief reflections on the guiding questions for this session. Having myself supported the negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC armed group for several years, 3 key lessons of relevance to today's peacemaking are the following. First, courageous political leadership committed to peace is fundamental. Without it, success is unlikely. It requires careful and discreet engagements and should be fostered over time. Second, preparing patiently and thoroughly is crucial. Even if silencing the guns requires urgent attention, peacemaking is messy and time-consuming, and negotiating a transformation from war to peace requires stamina and flexibility. And a well-prepared negotiating team is central. One that is also able to defend peace talks to their own constituencies. Third, there has to be a common vision on the end goal of negotiations. Absent a common vision, we're left with a series of transactional exchanges that can produce temporary agreements, but in which conflict relapse becomes likely. Creating the conditions for peace in today's conflicts requires us to marshal our respective comparative advantages, connections, and resources. In some highly fragmented contexts or regionalized armed conflicts, it is less and less likely that all relevant stakeholders will be willing or able to sit around a single table and produce a comprehensive peace agreement, as in the negotiations of the past. We need to openly discuss how our respective efforts across different levels and with different participants can produce synergies in what has been called multi-mediation in a recent report on adaptation and innovation in mediation. An organization such as mine, an unofficial non-state outfit willing to talk to all our actors everywhere, can test out ideas with groups and individuals seen by many as too controversial to engage. we can tease out real interests underpinning public positions and help the parties understand what a potential negotiation could deliver. Our efforts thus complement those of others who may enjoy better access of trust with certain parties or certain political leaders to encourage them to exercise the courageous leadership I mentioned. In this regard, I welcome the increasing number of states and organizations active today in mediation, each of which can bring something useful to the table. Some of us will also be able to help parties prepare for negotiations through capacity building or to develop negotiating strategies, while others will need to focus on the infrastructure of peace talks. What we should avoid is duplicative or uncoordinated efforts which can undermine mediators. As for mediators, it is true that they have to be impartial and treat all negotiating parties fairly. But mediators need to be more than that. They have to be credible and to be seen to help parties produce tangible and measurable improvements for civilians in conflict situations. It is their role, when negotiating parties are locked in confrontation, to keep the hope alive. That allows for the building over time of a common vision on the end point of negotiations. The voices of society are also crucial here. Channeling the hopes and aspirations of civilians bearing the brunt of violence can be catalytic, which is why finding mechanisms for their inclusion and participation is so important. The Colombian peace agreement's approach to issues of justice and accountability would not have been possible without the active participation and contribution of victims of the conflict. It unlocked possibilities that the parties may not have arrived to themselves. And in turn, this made the final peace agreement a reality. Beyond revealing solutions, inclusive peace processes deliver something else. They deliver responsive peace agreements that ultimately enjoy societal acceptance. And politically inclusive agreements accepted by society increase confidence in the future of the country, including its economic prospects. This, in my view, is a crucial driver of sustainability of peace agreements. Not only the ability to channel international support to challenging processes like ceasefires, disarmament, and elections, but also building the confidence of the private sector, domestic and foreign, to invest in the economy. I look forward to hearing from the panelists today. We are all in this together. If we are able to make this diverse group of states and other actors work effectively together by recognizing each other's strengths and roles, then we as a global community should be able to be more successful in waging peace in the time to come. Thank you very much.
Moderator, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Doug, thank you very much for your remarks and for setting the scene there. What I heard was inclusion, courage, preparation, common vision, and an aim for peace, not settling for smaller agreements. Our panelists have been introduced, so I'll get straight into it. Prime Minister Harper, I'm going to begin with you, because one thing that Doug was saying there is that we are living in an increasingly violent and divided world. I guess anyone who knows history, knows that nothing is unprecedented, but the times do feel violent and divided. These points that Doug has raised, do you think, given the current global climate, that the rules-based order is being challenged, not just by China or Russia, but by those who built it, by the United States? Do you think these sorts of mechanisms can apply to peacemaking today, when we are seeing these shifts in the rules-based order and also a focus on big power and spheres of influence?
Yeah, look, I actually think, and I say I'm not advocating this, it's just my analysis that the rules-based order, as we've known it, is ending. By the way, I think it was the aberration. Big powers with spheres of influence and kind of big power dynamics really determining issues of peace and war, at least at the kind of macro global level. That's the norm of human history. And I think we're returning to that. You've had over the past couple of generations, China, Russia, and Iran with, I think, increasing success, being able to jump in and out of the rules-based order as it suits them. And now you have, to be candid, the United States, really the originator of that post-war order, now largely doing the same thing. It doesn't mean that the mechanisms that our guests just talked about are irrelevant. I think it just means you have to put them. You have to decide what the bigger power context is. In the context of mediating Sudan, perhaps, or mediating Colombia, that's a very different set of lessons than the Russia-Ukraine war or the conflict in the Middle East, where big power politics are engaged. And it's just increasingly evident to me that the major powers will not be constrained by rules. They will be, we're moving, as Prime Minister Luxon said, from rules to power. They will be determined by how they judge their spheres of influence, judge their broader international priorities and interests, and how they decide to interact with competing powers. I think that will set the range of the possible in those kinds of bigger conflicts.
Where do you think that leaves middle powers then? If you've got big powers focused on their interests, middle powers like Canada, for example, where do you think that leaves them so that they're not squeezed?
Well, middle powers, Canada, I think to some degree, European Union or many European countries and others. I'm not sure whether India is big power or middle power. It's kind of straddling the fence, probably big power longer term. I think those middle powers will do one of three things. They will continue to try and push rules-oriented settlements, which may have limited application. They will try increasingly to hedge among the bigger powers. And they will increasingly, particularly I think in the case of the European Union, they will try to, and India, they will try to gain the hard power attributes necessary to genuinely compete in that big power determined dynamic.
And before I move on to the foreign minister of Norway, I just want to ask you, I mean, we are seeing this war of words between Canada and the United States around tariffs, trade. Would you think that if you were in power today, your relationship with Donald Trump would have been different?
Yeah. Look, I'd like to think that. I think it wouldn't be easy. But as I just and I rarely kind of speak out on Canadian public affairs. I just did write an op-ed on this, and I think it is necessary for Canada to have a plan. Canada probably to take some hard positions vis-a-vis the United States. But I think there's a difference between taking some hard negotiating positions versus just kind of shooting insults back. I don't think that may be emotionally satisfying, but not a terribly effective way of dealing with a much larger country. And actually, I think quite counterproductive.
Foreign Minister, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. We're just hearing there from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper talking about the European Union, potentially being sort of a middle power trying to find its place in all of this. I mean, in terms of the Ukraine war, you don't have a seat at the table as yet when it comes to peace negotiations. You are, NATO as a whole is upping its defense spending. And, that's come off the back of pressure from the Americans. But just where do you sit in terms of the Ukraine war, where you'd like to position yourself in this to perhaps get a seat at the table?
So
it's correct that there is no European seat at the table, but there's actually no table. So there are no negotiations going on now in the proper sense. I mean, there are preparatory talks on President Trump's initiative. He has spoken to Ukraine, spoke to Russia. They are discussing on whether to establish a table, and at least it is now clear that Ukraine will be at the table, which I think is rather obvious because the war is in Ukraine. So it would be very worrisome if two great powers, settled Ukraine without Ukraine. I think most other countries would agree that they don't want to go back to a world where great powers, make deals over the heads of those engaged. And we also strongly believe that there should be significant European contributions, both in substance, planning for negotiations, carrying them out, but because this is a war in Europe, and it's not only about Ukraine. I mean, it's a big thing in Ukraine, but it's also very much about the international order globally and in my continent. So we're working really hard now, and if one thing can be said, the alarm, the togetherness, the strategic preparations for what's going on now, which probably will be an end game to this war, is much higher now in Europe than it was. So that's at least one of the outcomes. And let me say, Norway has been involved as a mediator or as a facilitator, which are two slightly different roles, in many, many conflicts around the world. Because we were far away. I mean, far away from Colombia, relatively far away from the Middle East. Philippines, once upon a time Sri Lanka, were only partly successful, I would say. But but we've been involved many places. But we cannot take that role in Ukraine because we have a position in Ukraine, and we were not impartial. I mean, we want Ukraine to do as good as they can, and we don't want to reconfirm the type of behavior that Russia has promoted. That makes then we can be a supporter of the Ukrainian position. We can help Ukraine to develop position, for instance, but we would not be a typical mediator. And we'll be honest about that. These are two different roles. But if I may just add, continue on this, Sashi Taror and I have known each other for 30 plus years. And when we worked together or in the same field, it was in the early 90s when the world was opening up to saying, we're not any longer just avoiding conflict. We can actually transition. We can manage change from something that was static but not satisfactory into something better. Not taking away conflict, but taking out the violence and make new structures. And that was a short period of time where that was possible because we did not really have the great power conflicts. I mean, not that they were zero, but the world was not dominated by this sort of power strategic competition between great powers. Now we have that. So how do we bring with us the experiences from all the reasonably successful peace processes of the 90s and the 2000s and adapt them to a world where we do have, as Prime Minister Harper said, a more great power-driven world? So, I would say I agree with the analysis that we have more of that, but I also say that the rules-based order is only over if we want it to be over. If we really want to invest in it, the Indias, big India, small Norway, and all the others could still say that it's a good thing to preserve what you can. And if there are problems with it, let's go together and reform it, rather than defend it through reform and modernization and upgrading and so on. Because in the long run, we're all better off in a world where there are some key principles, and for instance, the respect for sovereignty. So all international cooperation, when I can work very well with Sweden, Carl Bildt is here, former Swedish Prime Minister, it's also because he knows that I'm not going to grab his country. And he's not going to invade my country, so we can, based on that, we can cooperate very closely, as I think Canada and the US could. And now it's getting more difficult because if you start asking whether you actually respect the sovereignty of another country, you get much more cautious.
So if Greenland was annexed by the United States, I mean, what would NATO do?
I'll tell you the secret now. Those of you who know NATO well, I think most people have heard about Article 5, which is the collective commitment to defense against external threats. But there's actually also an Article 1, because NATO was set up in 1945, only 4 years after the UN Charter. And the same people, some of the same people wrote the Atlantic Treaty. First thing you say, we will refrain from use of force or even threat of use of force among ourselves. We will be good citizens in our club. So I think if we are firm to the commitment of NATO itself, we should stop suggesting that we will, change borders without prior agreement.
But before I go to Shashi Tharoor, I just want to pick up on your point about Norway, as you say, for decades has been at the forefront of being a mediator, negotiator in different conflicts. We saw, of course, the Oslo Accords. You've been crucial as well in Mali in the 90s. You say that you've got competing interests in Ukraine, so therefore you cannot act as some kind of negotiator. That I understand. But peacekeeping forces, the UK, France, they're talking about offering peacekeeping forces. Are you saying that that's a problem as well?
So, a classical peacekeeping force, and I'm sitting here with somebody who worked very, very closely on this, is the expert, but the classical peacekeeping force, and even a more modernized type, is basically partial to the deal, not to a party. So you defend an agreement, but neutral or impartial to the two or more sides. That's a peacekeeping mission. You can have something else which is a kind of a security underpinning, some kind of security force which defend one side against change, but then it's not a peacekeeping force. So I think if there will be a European or NATO type of contribution, it will not be in the classical peacekeeping. I mean, that's more logical for maybe countries like India, but I don't think we who have taken such a clear position, correctly so in my view, can also be the peacekeeper of the deal. So again, it's helpful to distinguish the different roles, and both roles are fine. It's just that they should not be confused.
Correct.
Shashi Tharoor, I mean, the foreign minister there was saying that you're an expert in peacekeeping forces. You've worked in this area. I just want to pick up on that point he's just made about, would that be something that India would consider or toy with or engage with?
Fortunately, anything I say doesn't engage India since I'm in the opposition and not in the government. But Espen is right. And in fact, when you go back to the earlier part of this conversation, when you talked about the middle powers and so on, how did peacekeeping come about? Well, the UN Charter doesn't mention peacekeeping. The UN Charter envisaged that the big powers that had won World War II would get together and impose peace around the world. And peacekeeping was supposed to be the militaries of the five big powers who constituted the permanent members of the Security Council. But once the Cold War started, that became impossible. And so Dag Hammarskjöld had the brilliance to actually find countries whom one could broadly in those days refer to as middle powers, including India, Canada, Ireland, countries like that, to actually step in and do the peacekeeping that the big powers no longer could because they didn't agree with each other. So our not being engaged in the conflicts of the Cold War was actually a major asset in peacekeeping. Yeah. And that's why the catechism that Espen was summarizing evolved, that peacekeepers do not take sides. Our only side is peace itself. We are not interested in the victory of one or the other. In fact, we try not to get involved when one or the other side is still pursuing victory. It's when they have decided that they are ready for peace that peacekeepers come in. There's this wonderful old line from Brian Urquhart, the late great Brian Urquhart, who talked about never dive into an empty pool. That is, don't try and make peace when one or the other side is ready for peace. But once they are ready, then Espen is quite right. I mean, in fact, the Russians have made it explicit that they will not accept European peacekeepers who belong to NATO countries. They say they will not have NATO troops policing the peace in Ukraine. Now, that's an open statement by the Russian government. So, since pretty much all of Europe seems to belong to NATO these days, even can't build Sweden, I don't know where we're going to go. I mean, you'll have to look beyond Europe for your peacekeepers in Europe. And that may well be something that you would want to turn to India for. And certainly, speaking as an Indian parliamentarian, I don't think there's going to be a lot of resistance to that idea. I think there was resistance famously when there was a request at one point in 2003 for India to send troops to Iraq. And Parliament got together and passed a resolution saying in no circumstances should Indian peacekeepers go to Iraq after the American invasion. I don't see that happening for Ukraine. I think that if it were necessary and there was an agreed peace, I think there would be some willingness to consider, but I can't speak for the government. I'm in the opposition.
I know you're in the opposition and you're not in government, but Given the state of play right now with Russia and Ukraine and this conflict and President Trump's position, are you glad that India took the position it did? I mean, it carried on buying Russian oil and gas, for example.
Yes, I'm still wiping the egg off my face because I was the one person in the parliamentary debate who actually criticized the Indian position at the time, back in February 22, on the well-worn grounds that Espen will understand, because he and I talked about all this in my UN days, that there was a violation of the UN Charter, that there had been a violation of the principle of the inviolability of borders, of the sovereignty of a member state, namely Ukraine, and we had always stood for the inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes. And all of those principles, I said, had been violated by one party, and we should have condemned it. Well, a couple of years later, 3 years later, it does look like I'm the one with egg on my face, because clearly the policy has meant that India has actually a prime minister who can hug both the president of Ukraine and the president of Moscow 2 weeks apart and be accepted in both places. And therefore, India is in a position where it can make a difference to a lasting peace, if it was so required, in ways that very few countries would be able to. And it's partially, I mean, again, going back to some of the things that Stephen Harper and Espen said, distance helps. The fact that we're not in Europe and we're not directly, one way or the other, threatened or benefiting from any change in territorial borders, for example, that helps. The fact that the two parties seem to be ready to agree to peace. The fact that there would presumably be some very serious international backing for an international peacekeeping venture. I mean, all of those things have to be borne in mind before you answer the question that you just asked, Yamba. As an Indian government, a person making such a decision, those considerations would really have to be uppermost before they say yes or no. But I can see it entirely possible that in these circumstances, India would say yes.
Fascinating.
Remember, India's got 250,000 peacekeepers in its history around the world.
Yeah.
It's participated in, God knows, 49 peacekeeping missions, I think, in its history. So this is a country with an extensive record of having gone out to places far removed from India's direct interests in order to serve the cause of peace.
Yeah.
So why not?
Yeah. Fascinating. I'm going to bring in a former Prime Minister, Musa, because, of course, Mali has dealt with a number of peace agreements. One that about a year ago collapsed, even though Mali was bleeding for some time. There was a peace agreement. The different warring sides had come to the negotiating table. Do you think that you've been failed by, external forces interfering in the affairs of your nation?
Thank you very much. As you said, our country has signed at least 3 peace agreements the last 30 years. And one of these agreements was signed under the United Nations involvement and with peacekeepers. And finally, our leaders decided to fire the peacekeepers of the United Nations. But my understanding of what happened is the lack of political will, seriously, especially from the government. And if the government, we should settle the peace agreement, doesn't really want to move forward in the peace system, it will not work. This is the first thing. The second is the advantage taken from peace compared to the status quo. Both sides, we signed the peace agreement with rebellion group. From the rebellion group side and the government side, the status quo was comfortable, more comfortable than going to the settlement of the peace agreement. This is also something very important for the success of the peace process. To make status quo more expensive than going to the peace. The peace should be more interested compared to the status quo. This is the second thing. The first is the mediator. and the neutrality of the mediator, or the perception of the neutrality of the mediator. In our case, Algeria, our neighbor country, has been always involved in the different peace agreements. And Algeria looks like not really neutral on this stage. Also, that disturbed a lot the peace agreement. And finally, the soldiers who lead the country now, they decided to cut the peace process and try to internalize the peace process. They are not doing well, but the will to internalize also is interesting. For me, the most important thing for the peace in the country is internally. Political will, social readiness of the society to go forward to the peace and to deal with the root cause of the rebellion. I think we have to try to find the right way on that to resettle a peace process for our country and to achieve it. And I have to mention also the regional concern, because now we are not only the country which is involved in difficulties, security difficulties. We have Burkina Faso, we have Niger, and the situation is becoming regional, but even geopolitical situation, and we have also to deal with that.
Yes, because of course, there's also been a sort of foreign influence in a place like Mali. I mean, we saw the Wagner group fighting alongside, forces in Mali as well. That has played a role in preventing peace because there's been external factors, people flooding weapons, for example, into these countries, preventing sort of peace from being achieved, even if society has wanted it.
The Wagner issue is not, for me, as important as what I mentioned first, because dealing with Russia, hiring mercenaries, it is a soldier decision. It is a military decision. They think they need to empower the army in order to get a victory, because the military, they are focused on victory instead of settling a peace process. This is not really the most important thing I would like to light on. The most important thing is the political will. And now it is not really the case, because the military, they are more focused on victory, military victory, than settling a peace process. The social readiness, the different civil society involvement internally, this is also important. And the environment. Now we have to find maybe one innovative way to settle a real and a strong peace process, not only in Mali, but in the Sahelian region. Now, as I said, Burkina Faso and Niger, neighboring country, they are facing the same terrorist issue, even the rebellion issue also. And we have to find an innovative way to go on that. I am not really certain that the external powers and the external countries, they are as impactful as mentioned on the medias. The most important thing is the internal political will, political leadership, the governance, and the society wanted to accompany the political will on the way to get a real and a sustainable peace process in this. And then I think the regional bodies, African Union, ECOWAS, even United Nations or the international player could accompany. I am not sure they are as impactful as mentioned in the medias.
I'm going to come to you, Comfort, and bring the panel full circle. The crux of this panel, the focus is waging peace. Do you feel that we are in an era of peace, or this is a moment of, reckoning for the globe, or are we really just in an era of confrontation and it's about managing those different conflicts?
I think it's the last 2 points that you raised, that we are in reckoning, but also managing. And I want to go full circle to what Prime Minister Stephen Harper was saying, because we're in an era where wars are rising, but more critically, we're in a situation where the institutions that would normally regulate and manage these processes themselves are not trusted in the way that they used to be. I mean, you referred back to the era of Dag Hammarskjöld, right? And very well respected, trusted. And the UN is no longer necessarily the first port of call, partly because the Security Council that has a mandate to address these issues itself is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
Itself is breaking down. Itself is polarizing and oftentimes toxic as well. And when you have one of the key members of the Security Council, contemporary times, being seen as a aggressor, then it makes it very difficult to begin to work out the process for conflict management. By the way, Russia is not the first aggressor in the council, so we should just put that on the table as well. But I also think that we are in a completely different era. So I hate to say it, but we also should be truthful to ourselves that I'm afraid, Prime Minister, you and I are good friends, but I'm afraid that it looks as though the rules-based order is on the verge of being consigned into the museum. Now, the question, however, is as we are in a world in transition. As we transition into the next era, and here I would like to attach myself to what you're saying, is what can we take of the old world, what we thought was worth cherishing, that can accompany us into this new world. And now I think there is a viable conversation to be made. I will firmly attach myself to the principle of non-aggression. I think that's fundamental, because the countries that were born out of the United Nations, what bound them together was the principle of non-aggression, was also the principle of not changing borders. This has been a core principle, for example, in Africa. The African Union, or its predecessor, was very clear that we weren't going to change the colonial boundaries in which some of our countries found ourselves in. And we were pretty clear about sovereignty as well, about what binds us together. These are universal. So if I'm going to cling on to anything that accompanies us into this new world that we're yet to be born in, we don't know what the contours are going to look like, it's not been etched out quite clearly, I would like to think that we can safeguard one of the fundamentals about non-aggression, and also this expansionist territorial integrity, grabbing of territories as well. So I do take seriously this notion about what President Trump is saying about Panama and Greenland and even Canada. I do take it seriously, because he may green light other players in the international arena to jump on that bandwagon and decide that they're going to wake up and threaten the viability of another country. So whether he is able to grab those is not the issue.
Do you mean China on Taiwan?
But normalizing the language that you can decide the fate of another country. I do worry about that, even if the ambition on Greenland, and we understand what's going on in Greenland anyway, why he's saying it, but even if he utters it, it gives others, and it normalizes an agenda which I think is quite frankly dangerous as well.
I'm going to come to you in a second, Comfort, because I can see the foreign minister wanting to launch an intervention.
Just to react, I mean, obviously, as both Comfort and Prime Minister Harper says, the rules-based order is in deep trouble. I mean, it might even be in the emergency room, but it's not dead yet. And I think that, so my call, I was, Norway is a guest country at the G20 this year and last year, and this year with South Africa. And the foreign ministers meeting, that was the first meeting of this year. One observation I made, it was my own observation, it's not written down, but is that there was a better dialogue between the rest of the West, meaning Europeans and Canadians on the one hand, and many of the global South powers, about this being a problem that we might have to do something about. Because what's happening, of course, the two of the founding fathers, I mean, Russia, which is a successor to the Soviet Union, who clearly violated it by invading, a sovereign country, and the new tone in the US administration. I mean, we could all lay down and say, this is too bad, sorry, it was nice when it worked. Or we can see if we can invest in upholding, defending. And I think a key point then is that we need to apply the rules uniformly. because there's no higher power in the world. I mean, the global system is principally anarchic, and then we try to bring some order into it. And little Norway, for instance, we have been very adamant to say we criticize Russian violations of the UN Charter in Ukraine, but we also criticize Israel's excessive use of force against Gaza, and we need to do both. And it's actually when you criticize your friends that you show that the rules are for real, because it's not very costly for a Western politician to criticize Russia. I mean, it's correct, but it's not really a shocking statement if we are a NATO member. It is more courageous to say we have been critical of Israel, not because we don't think they should defend themselves against terrorism, but because we have way overdoing it and they violated, Geneva Conventions and so on. So I think that if we, and I would call it an Indian crowd, is the most populous country in the world. I mean, rather than thinking alongside the lines of non-alignment when nobody else is aligned, what are you non-aligned against if there's no alignment anywhere? But rather saying, how would we like to see the world? And maybe if we should be the first carrier of the message, how to organize the world, but because there are so many advantages to agreeing on some key principles of, trade, on international relations in general, on cooperating on health and cooperating on climate. There are so many advantages to that part of the international order that it is a little bit up to us whether we accept it to be that. But it is in the emergency room, so it is in trouble.
I think this is the crux of the matter, right? That there's a sense that there's a lack of consistency in how the rules are applied, and which is why you don't necessarily see a lot of countries wanting to cling on to it. But you're right, there are a number of countries who still also, by a good example, still rush to the United Nations because they see it as the core bastion, still want to preserve some core principles because they see it as essential to their own survival. But when the architects of the rules-based order are seen as violating those rules, it's very hard to convince others that they should continue to come. That's the core challenge. But I mean, in the end, we are on the same.
But I'm not sure it's all that new. I mean, the fact
no,
is,
it's not new.
I mean,
exactly.
the rules-based order. There have been various rules-based orders going back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and the rules were always written by a few. What made them useful was they were accepted by everyone, that they were essentially rules that everyone felt they could play by. No one really believed the playing field was level. No. I mean, when 15 of you sit around the Security Council table, you know that 14 of them have relationships with the US that perhaps matter more to them than with those of the other 13. And that's going to be a factor weighing in their minds. So I think it would be naive of us to imply there ever was some sort of ideal, simple, but totally rules-based system like a cricket team playing by the laws of the game. No, it was always a slightly uneven world. Look, having said that, there was nonetheless the sense that it applied to everybody. And yet, since the UN was established, Britain and France, two of the permanent members, invaded Egypt over the Suez crisis within 11 years of the UN being established. We've had the US invasion of Iraq. We've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there have been examples of permanent members violating the rules before. I wish we wouldn't therefore get so apocalyptic about the way things are today. It's still salvageable.
Yeah, I'm not even worried about that. Let's go back to the era where you were at the UN.
Yep.
And there were some core issues that you also felt was sacrosanct. So I'm not worried about realpolitik. We live in it as well.
We live in it.
But when you asked me a question about are we living in a situation of wars rising, we have never seen it so bad. Where the idea that you could see this grave level of human suffering, of indignity, of hunger, as famine, the level of insecurity, the way in which you're seeing guardrails that used to prevent the horrors that you're seeing in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Gaza, the ceasefire. Let's not forget, as now the question marks as to whether the ceasefire is broken or we can get into phase 2 in Gaza. I mean, the scale of human suffering, of the human cost, of deprivation that we're seeing is fundamentally different from when you were at the United Nations. And I think we have to acknowledge it
Rwanda and
was.
Bosnia in the 90s.
Yeah, we said never again. We said never again, and we're sitting on the altar of millions of people who are dying across the world. That is what is different, and I don't see the system being able to rectify that anytime soon.
You're right, Comfort, but there is a difference because back in this lovely 80s, there was a lot of death and violence. I mean, there were massacres in Rwanda. It was the Balkan Wars. The world was full of violence and death. But there was a sense that we knew what to do about it. That the outcome would be we help this country or this region to transform into modern democratic societies, and we will have a peace deal, and we will implement the peace deal with peacekeepers and so on, and eventually it will move forward. And in many cases, they did. Many of these operations worked. So it was not the amount of violence, but it was more. There was still a hope that these were transitional problems that eventually would be solved, and I think that hope is not so obvious any longer.
I'm just going to. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to open up the floor to the audience. If you could make your way to the microphone wherever it is, I think it's in the middle somewhere. And if you could keep your questions brief and no statements, please, as we only have 10 minutes. I think there's a microphone going around, or in those corners. Yeah, go ahead.
Kodaro here. My question is to Dr. Tharoor and also the President of the Crisis Group. We are in a state of increased defense industrialization and weapons development. All states are striving for this in the name of sovereignty and strategic autonomy. My question is, to what extent is this compatible with long-term peace?
With long-term peace?
Peace, yeah.
I mean, the fact is that, the old cliche that if you want peace, prepare for war still holds good.
Yeah.
That is that one of the reasons you develop defense preparedness is to ensure that no one is tempted to go to war against you. We don't want to allow our neighbors to feel we're so weak that they can conduct adventures against us. In that process, therefore, we develop defense, hoping we'll never have to use it. I mean, Canada hasn't been to war ever, as far as I know, since 1812. But they've got a very good army, which they do send out to the world for peacekeeping purposes. And that sort of logic is entirely applicable to many of us. Of course, India has had to fight wars. We've had some real crises on our borders. And the same people who fought those wars have also gone out and done peacekeeping and would be willing to do so again. And they're tempered by the experience of this. But when Espen talked about, for example, that there's no non-alignment anymore, the fact is we're living in this world of the World Wide Web, aren't we? We're all networked now. We're connected to each other for different purposes in different ways. And because the world is like the World Wide Web, we should be prepared at any point to use that connection, that expertise, that capacity anywhere in the world. I think we are. India is.
I'm just going to take some questions from the Raisina Young fellows in the back, if you could.
Thank you, and thanks for the very interesting insights. Josiane Koutaï from Bhutan, the smallest member state in the European Union, which has got neutrality enshrined in the constitution and which does not form part of NATO, and has also facilitated peace talks between Gorbachev and Bush way back for the end also of that war, and has offered recently peace discussions, also to hold these peace discussions between Ukraine and Russia, if we hopefully get there. My question to you all is, I would like to hear your comments as to what you think could be the role of states, member states of the European Union, which do not form part of NATO, which are not military strong, and other states in Asia and in other parts of the world, which are not the original architects of the institutions we know today, in these peacekeeping efforts, because I think that we should also look beyond the great traditional powers.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to bring that back to the panel.
I have to ask a European to answer that.
Well, I mean, sometimes you need countries that are neutral or impartial to a conflict to be it can be the venue, sometimes maybe facilitating, precisely because they have that identity of not being big, not being powerful, and not being directly invested. I mean, in the Cold War, I mean, many of the conversations between the Soviet Union and the US took place in Finland or Austria, precisely because of that capacity. So if we're returning to this kind of world, there is a space for countries like Malta.
I believe there's a question right here.
Does the panel we are witnessing all over empire? I have another question to you. The rise of the nation is very often partnered with the rise of the novel. Now, is the novel dying? Is that why my question is that why I haven't read a novel from you for so long? But we took now one is for the panel, the other.
Well, I think I'll leave it to the panel. So this is President Nasheed, the former president of the Maldives, who knows whereof he speaks because he had to deal with very many big powers leaning very heavily on him over the years, I'm sure. No, with your second question, President, I have to say that I've barely had the time to do the writing I do. But to write fiction, one needs not just time, but a space inside one's head to create an alternative universe that's as real to you as the world you're really living in, with characters, episodes, dialogues that actually matter as much to you as what you encounter in everyday life. And in Indian politics, you don't have the luxury of that, I'm afraid. So I've not been able to create that world for myself. One day, I promise you a novel. I'll come and give it to you personally, but not yet.
Signed.
I think there was a question there.
I want to ask the first part of President Nasheed's question, because we talked about this yesterday, really suggesting we're seeing the kind of the fall or the beginning of the fall of the American empire. I don't actually agree with that. I think the reality is the United States remains the world's preeminent power by almost every measure, by quite a distance. But I think what you are seeing is a shift of the United States view of its role in the world, from being a maintainer of a global system to being because it believes it can no longer, frankly, effectively do that role, to being a country that simply acts according to its own interests, in its own, for lack of a better term, sphere of influence. There may be, and look, there may be with President Trump a kind of a discontinuity there, but I think the trend is going to continue. I think that's just the reality.
Beyond President Trump.
Yes, I don't think it will necessarily be as extreme as we're seeing now, but I think the trend will continue because I think there is a really good argument from the standpoint of the United States that trying to play its previous role is simply draining its resources and not effective.
I mean, yes, but and I agree with Prime Minister Harper that Trump can also be, the Trump and the MAGA movement can also be seen as a symptom, not only a cause. It's an extreme version of something which has developed over time. But it is, if not the end of an empire, it is in a sense an end of hegemony, and it's not imposed by others. It's a sort of a self-chosen abdication of the role of an hegemon. I would say, as the transatlantic system from Norway and the NATO devotee, we were ready, we are and remain ready to help the US to uphold its hegemony. They don't need to pay all the military resources. We can do more. I mean, not only we, but we Europeans, for instance, Canada can do more. And because at the height of its power, it was the combination of military might, political influence, economic and trading patterns, and idea power that people were attracted. At least in my part of the world, people wanted to be close. They were not forced to. It was quite attractive to be close to the US. And that might become less attractive, and people look elsewhere. So, how smart is that? I question myself and my American friends to abdicate when nobody really has told you to.
Yeah.
There's one final question just at the back.
How would he have reacted to being called governor of the 51st state?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I let it go by.
My question is, regarding the rule of China and Iran is
Russia and Iran is openly not obeying the rules, and China is strategically doing this. So my question is directly that how geopolitical alliances and partnerships will help us to, really lead them to follow that rule-based order. So that would be the benefits for all of the nations as well as people. So my question is that geopolitical alliance, how it will lead them to follow the rule-based order.
Okay. But you said there are no more rules.
Yeah,
Well, you said that rules evolve over time and we all get
They
to
do,
pick
but I
and
mean,
choose.
I think the short answer. I mean, you may have seen just
Yeah.
yesterday the Indian Prime Minister made a very positive statement about relations with China, even though we've had some pretty tough times with them over the last 4 or 5 years. I suppose the message there is, let us take them at face value. Let us assume that they will live up to the laws, the rules that we're all exalting right now. But at the same time, I mean, the old Reagan line, trust but verify, you have to be absolutely sure that they are doing so. And if they don't, then those are the standards against which you will calibrate your reactions accordingly. I mean, the truth is that I don't want to single out a particular country here, as you've done in your question, but in general, member states of the United Nations have not always upheld every single principle of the Charter. There have been violations, there have been transgressions. But if you broadly agree on what the rules are supposed to be, then you can hold countries to account for actually upholding those rules. And that's frankly the way we'd have to do it, whether it's with the country you mentioned, China in this particular case, or anywhere else. And I don't know, the Prime Minister of Mali is sitting there, what he's been through with his country and with the, I mean, perhaps you might want to address this question. So how would you look at law, at these rules of law internationally?
For a country like in Africa, we are interested effectively to see the global player respecting the rules and the settling of the rule of law. But we know also if it comes to the interests and the geopolitical interests also, the rules of law sometimes is putting aside. This is the thing I would like to talk about. And finally, the most important, and I started by that, in our case, is to focus on our own situation first. And to try to find a way internally to solve our own problem by our own strengths and our own means. This is the most important thing. And I would like to end also to say there are some other players, not a nation, like an international organization. And I am a member of one organization like Club de Madrid, which is composed by former head of state and former chief of government, which can be helpful to accompany, to find an innovative way and to help the government like in Africa to solve their problem. Like I would like to talk about that also.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Unfortunately, our time here is up, but thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks.
Thank you. Okay, good. Thank you. Merci, Prime Minister. Thank you.
That was great.
Great to see you again.